Hello, my name's Jodie Brunning from PSGR NZ, and tonight I'll be talking to Professor Philippe Grandjean. It's the morning for him from the University of Southern Denmark. He's just published a paper, The Dose Dependence of Prenatal Fluoride Exposure Associations with Cognitive Performance at School Age in 3 prospective studies. His co-authors include colleagues from the University of Copenhagen, the Odense University Hospital, and researchers from the United States and Canada. It's been published in the European Journal of Public Health. And I'll pass it over to Professor Grandjean to provide a little bit of background and get us starting with the interview today.
Grandjean, I'm a professor of environmental medicine at the University of Southern Denmark. And I'm also a research professor at the University of Rhode Island after having been for 20 years adjunct professor at Harvard.
Thank you. And you've also chaired committees. You've been a member of the EFSA panel on contaminants, a member of the WHO European Advisory Committee. So you've served on many committees, so you're eminently qualified to talk about the issue that we have at hand and the paper we're going to talk about today and the background to that paper. Philippe Grandjean, would you like to provide a background to the paper we're going to talk about?
When I was first in the United States as a young physician, my mentor, Irving Selikoff, in New York City, suggested to me that I look at the fluoride exposure at the cryolite factory. This was located in Copenhagen, and the cryolite ore came from Greenland. It's the only mine of cryolite which is a fluorine-rich mineral, and it was used for example, aluminum production. So when I returned to Denmark, I got hold of the factory and I got access to worker data back to 1926. And I then started working with the Danish Cancer Registry, which is the oldest in the world, so that we could follow the cancer experience of these workmen from 1942. And what we found was that fluoride was associated with bladder cancer. Interestingly, there was no particular excess risk of lung cancer. If you thought this one might be due to smoking, then tobacco smoking, then you would see much more lung cancer and maybe a little bit of additional bladder cancer, but it was the reverse. And there was an association with the duration of employment. So that got me interested in fluoride, of course. And I hate to say, but our papers on cancer in relation to fluoride exposure have barely been cited internationally because there is a lack of willingness to consider that fluoride can be associated with cancer. But we don't know for sure if this is only something that happens at the kind of exposures seen in cryolite workers who got maybe 20 or 30 milligrams of fluoride per day, which is a lot more than people get when they drink fluoride from the community water, which may just be a couple of milligrams per day rather than 20 or 30. But anyway, it got me started along with Harvard colleagues. We started looking at the multiple studies of fluoride in regard to children's brain development, because at that point I had already published on lead and mercury in regard to brain development in children. And it turned out that there was really a lot of support for fluoride being what we call a developmental neurotoxicant.
And Professor, would that be around 2012 or earlier?
Yeah, that's about 10 years ago. And we then decided that we wanted to do our own study, actually in China, in the southwestern Sichuan, and in a place called Jianing. But anyway, we found the same thing in our study, and it was particularly strong in children who had spots on their teeth, what we call dental fluorosis, so that they had actually received fluoride during the tooth formation in early development, where the brain is also being developed. And so it's a critical age. And so from that time, I more or less decided to go ahead and see if I could get access to cohort data, that is prospective studies where we start getting urine samples from the mother during pregnancy to see how much fluoride she has circulating in the body, and that she is sharing across the placenta with her fetus, and where it then gains access to the fetal brain. And so we finally had a situation where there was a Danish cohort with a couple of thousand kids and their mothers, and we were able to measure fluoride in maternal urine samples and get the data together. And because that study was conducted at a low exposure situation, it wasn't very informative by itself. But then we were able to communicate with colleagues with whom we had worked before, who had done studies in Canada and Mexico. And we then did a joint paper based on the 3 cohorts, that is Mexico, Canada, and Denmark. And this was just published.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And Philippe, there's a lot of number crunching that's gone into this one, but I think from what I understand, and you'll draw it out a little bit more, what is quite elegant is that the Danish cohort, the OCC group, that sort of theoretically it didn't tell you much. It didn't say there's a massive association going on here. It was very subtle and nuanced, and it let the other 2, the Mexican group and the Canadian group, sort of iterate what was going on. Can you explain a bit more about that, please?
Right. When we looked at the data, we first compared the Danish results with the 2 others. And we found that they did not differ from each other. It was kind of flat, the association between fluoride in the mother's urine and the child's IQ at age 7. But, you know, the IQ varies a lot, mainly at that age from genetic reasons. And so it's hard to see if there is some association going on, because there's a lot of variability. And at the same time, we just had a single urine sample from the mothers, so the exposure wasn't very exact. But when we merged with the 2 other studies, the picture became clearer in that the distributions of fluoride exposures overlapped. And so we were able to see that there was a dose-dependent decrease in the children's IQ. And what we then did was to carry out calculations exactly the way that the European Food Safety Authority would do it, or the American, the US Environmental Protection Agency. And it's something called benchmark dose calculations. And the first choice you have to make when you make that calculation is to decide how much of impact on the child's brain development would you consider adverse. And EPA and others have traditionally decided that 1 IQ point is bad. And so if it's less than 1, then you could say, hey, that's no more than the uncertainty when you measure the IQ, so we can't really call that adverse. But certainly economists would also say that on average, having an extra IQ point will mean that you are more likely to complete a long education and also getting a better paid job. And so we went with this algorithm, this tradition that to carry out the calculations that way, and it showed that a fluoride concentration in the urine of about 0.3 milligrams per liter would be the benchmark dose level or concentration level. And this is what's normally used by the authorities to develop an exposure limit. In America, for example, they would then add an uncertainty factor of 10, so that you get from 0.3 to 0.03 milligrams per liter, which is, of course, very, very low, and it may not be necessary. But the important point is that if there is 0.3 milligrams per liter in the drinking water, then on average, people will have at least 0.3 milligrams per liter in the urine. And this obviously depends on whether it's hot and we drink a lot of water because we sweat so much. Then the urine concentration will be higher. It will also depend on the additional fluoride we get. And I would think in New Zealand, you probably drink a lot of tea. And tea is known to, or most kinds of tea, particularly black tea, in particularly black tea from East Africa, which is what's commonly used in tea bags. And so just from drinking a couple of cups of tea per day can easily add something like a milligram per liter of fluoride in the urine. So, but anyway, the basis is what's in the drinking water. And that's where we're now saying we better be more careful, because by using fluoride or adding fluoride to drinking water or having high acceptability levels, that will be a problem for women who happen to get pregnant, and also small children. They have no benefit. The children who don't have teeth yet, they will not benefit, because the benefit is when you get the fluoride in the oral cavity, so that the fluoride can strengthen the enamel. There's no benefit from getting it in the circulation, and certainly an infant is in the midst of a very, very intensive brain development, where we really have to do everything we can to remove mercury, lead, pesticides, fluoride, etc., to emphasize the importance of brain development in the next generation.
And Professor, you've done a lot of work on the developmental origins of health and disease, so you've got a very sound understanding. So this is, of course, prenatal and postnatally. It's during infancy, like in toddlerhood and childhood, and extending into the teen years. And we've seen recently economic analysis of the cost to society. I think, the Atina et al. Paper looking at the cost of society for neurodevelopmental delays. We're going to show an image of Bruce Lanphear's video where he shows that whole curve moving across, and less people being in the highly intelligent, more people being delayed and challenged and needing assistance. So this is something we're actually seeing, in society, but it's very hard to put a finger on it, to put a point on it. And the work you're doing is drawing attention to the toxicants in society that can contribute to us not being as intelligent and as we would like, and not earning as much money, and having it being a tougher life for people. Would you say that? Is there something more that people need to hear about the developmental origins of health and disease?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're already talking about climate change, where the present adults have taken advantage of some possibilities to get cheap energy, and then they are causing problems that the next generation will inherit without having had the same benefits. And so there is something in regard to having skeletons in the closet. And it's the same phenomenon with the persistent poisons. I mean, lead and mercury don't break down, and we are still suffering added lead exposure from past uses of lead in paints and as a petrol additive, and likewise with fluoride. We think that it's advantageous in prevention of caries in children, and it may have a small effect. It's not so clear nowadays because there's fluoridated toothpaste. And that, I mean, you're not supposed to swallow it. That's an important point. But if you just use toothpaste in the oral cavity, you're brushing your teeth. It does have a benefit, and then it gets hard to see if the drinking water has a benefit at all nowadays. And therefore, it doesn't make sense to expose pregnant women and small infants to fluoride, because it's also a toxicant. And that was an issue that was not considered in the past by authorities in America. And for example, the World Health Organization relies on a recommendation from 1986. It has not been updated, has not taken into account that fluoride now is very, very clearly a developmental neurotoxicant. And therefore, our generation is imposing risks on the next generation, and perhaps even further, by using a toxic element for a short-sighted benefit.
Yes, and the European Food Safety Authority are very clear that this is not a nutrient. Fluoride is not a nutrient, whereas the New Zealand and the Australian authorities have called it in their policy papers a micronutrient. So when you have this distorted kind of idea, and we're not able to appropriately refer to it as a toxicant, it distorts how we look at it. So then we can see in, for example, the Australian and New Zealand papers that a lot of the epidemiological studies have been dismissed because they want to look at black and white guidelines. And this is, I presume it's a difficulty you've faced, because so much of the evidence around toxicants is very slow to build up that will be accepted by the authorities. And I think that's why you've positioned this paper the way you have.
It's clear that science is not always something straightforward to interpret. There could be reports that show different outcomes, but there are two things to say in this regard, and that is sometimes studies that really don't show a fluoride effect. And I've also seen one that shows a positive effect of fluoride. One has to look at the design And do we really know what the prenatal exposure was in this case? And when was the IQ determined? And what were the methods, etc.? And it's very clear to me that that the studies that show an effect of fluoride on average are better designed than studies that don't show anything, because there are some, and so it's not a matter of democratic decision, like how many are for, how many are against here. It's a matter of looking at the quality, the weight of the evidence. And because some people say, oh, but you can't trust studies from China or India or whatever country far away. And that's why we went to China and worked with the Chinese CDC and with local scientists. And I must say, we had a very, very good collaboration, and the results were clear. So I have no problem believing the Chinese reports. I still have to look at the design carefully before I believe their results. But one should not dismiss human studies like this from other countries for whatever cultural belief. These are people from the same species, and I would say that's more important than doing another study on rats.
Yes, yes, and that was interesting, because the second study you did in China, if I'm not correct, was in 2014. We looked at a very small sample size, but it looked at the association with fluorosis.
Yeah.
And so that informed you.
Yeah, but that was simply for us to understand how research can be done in China, and basically we followed the advice of the Chinese CDC, and they were very much aware of the problems carrying out studies in a small community like the one we chose. But I think it worked very well. They were very qualified scientists.
Yes, yes. And then what is marvelous with the set of the 3 studies that you've pulled together is the Denmark study had 837 mother-child groups. The Mexican study that was called Element had 355, I think, and Canada was 470. So you had a very, you know, this was sufficiently powered for you to come to a very strong conclusion.
I think so. I mean, there are very few cohort studies that I'm aware of that count on detailed information on mother-child pairs in a number of, I mean, we had 1,500. That's very impressive in my mind, if I may say so.
I think it is. And then you performed a regression analysis which would analyze the relationship between the predictive variable, which I would presume, but I'm not a scientist, is IQ, and the response variable, which would be the fluoride concentration. That would be correct. And then
we did simple regression analyses, correlations. We took a variety of factors into regard, and then we also did the more complicated calculations that the authorities need, because you know you cannot observe a threshold. A threshold is, I mean, how do you determine if it's above or below? You can't do that in studies like this. So we have to calculate our best measure of where the threshold might be, and this is what's called the benchmark dose level. And we did it the way that it has been done for decades, the way that authorities internationally like to see the data.
And was that to do with deriving the 2 piecewise linear models? So you had the different breakpoints. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we tried different things. We tried to see if it was curvy, linear like that, or it had a break point somewhere. And it turned out that the linear slope was the best fit. So I mean, this is what the authorities do too. They stick to as simple a model as possible because it's easier to interpret.
Exactly. So, and the joint analysis I'm reading here of all three cohorts showed a statistically significant association between urine fluoride and IQ, with a benchmark analysis of 0.45 milligrams per liter, while the BMCL was 0.28 milligrams per liter. So, and this was slightly higher than the benchmark previously reported for the two North American cohorts, the Canadian and the Mexican cohorts alone. And this is on table S3 for anyone that's wanting to look it up. Can you explain the difference for everyone between the BMC of the benchmark of 0.45 and the BMCL of 0.28, please?
Right. So the benchmark dose or benchmark concentration is the level that is associated with a loss of 1 IQ point. Oh, and so we don't want that to happen, and we can't be sure that all of the kids are equally vulnerable, and we can't be sure that there's not some uncertainty playing a role or causing a bias towards zero. And therefore, authorities say you better calculate the lower confidence limit, the 95% confidence limit. And this is what's called the benchmark dose level. And this is what is used for determining exposure limits by these authorities. And that's, we did exactly that. So the benchmark dose level is about 0.3. And yes, the benchmark dose is 0.48, but to be sure, we better use the lower confidence limit of 0.3. That's
beautiful. That's really, really important to understand that. And I'm aware. So, for example, for lead, as Lanphier demonstrates, for the first sort of 100 parts per billion, there's quite a large loss of IQ points, and then as it goes up another, there's a couple more, and then that would be just speculating. You can't understand how fluoride will impact in consideration of the amount of IQ points that will be lost. We'll just sit at the 1 IQ point for now.
The calculation is based on what does it take to cause a loss of 1 IQ point, because that's the minimal adverse effect we're looking for. But clearly, if exposures are substantially higher, then the calculation suggests that we're talking about up to several IQ points. And then we're really getting into a problem that everybody would agree that's really, really bad. I mean, who would want their kids to lose, say, 5 IQ points or something? That's really going to impact on their schooling and education, and also economic income in the future. So let's rather be on the safe side, and like it has been decided internationally, let's go for keeping the effect below 1 IQ point and use this benchmark calculation to guide us toward having a safe exposure level for fluoride.
Yes, and it's quite black and white, because adding fluoride to drinking water is an action that we don't need to do. if your work is correct, and the indication from quite a lot of literature, there is no need to add fluoride to drinking water, because there is this indication of harm that it could be quite considerable, really.
But fluoride does occur naturally in groundwater. So, but if you look at this internationally, then pretty often you see levels of 0.2, 0.3 milligrams per liter. But there are areas, and I'm not sure if there are any in New Zealand.
Yeah, there are.
But certain, okay, and certainly in parts of Asia, in China, for example, or Sri Lanka, India, etc. And certainly there's spots also in Europe, and there's an area in the southwestern United States where there's naturally perhaps even 1.5 or 2 milligrams per liter, or even higher. And we know that there are problems with that. That's when you get into the dental fluorosis, the malformation of the enamel, but you also get into skeletal fluorosis with bone malformations and difficulty walking, etc. So fluoride is really well known for being a toxic element, and you can get that naturally, but in many parts of the world, levels are not very high. So perhaps it's meaningful that we see beginning of an adverse effect when the level is above 0.3 milligrams per liter, and when there is a natural background, at least in major parts of the world, about that. So it would make sense to me if humans have evolved in a world or in that particular part of the world with low fluoride concentrations in the drinking water. I'm also thinking about lakes and rivers, we shouldn't aim at a very much higher level of fluoride in the drinking water, because this is what the research has shown in recent decades. It can harm our very, very sensitive brain development.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I know in New Zealand the epidemiological data is downplayed by our NZ-EPA, and interestingly, the current studies aren't going through New Zealand's EPA; they're going through the Ministry of Health. So they're treating it more like a nutrient. New Zealand does have background levels of fluoride, and at the end of this talk for the New Zealanders watching, maybe in 2017 the Centre for Public Health Research looked at New Zealand, and some areas such as Wellington already have fluoridated water, but many of the other areas that might not have fluoridated water seem to have very strong levels in many ways. So that was quite interesting. We're almost finished, but one of the questions I would like to ask you, when in 2016, the Australian New Zealand authorities were assessing which studies were appropriate to be included in the assessment, looking at sort of assessment of fluoride. And they looked at the grade GRADE assessment. Are you familiar with that? That's through the WHO, I believe. And okay. They decided with this assessment that fluorosis and dental caries were critical to decision-making, while neurocognitive and developmental disorders were important but not critical. They downweighted neurocognitive and developmental disorders. Do you think with the work you have undertaken and what you and your colleagues are saying, that we should be downweighting the neurodevelopmental, the cognitive effects of fluoride exposures for populations?
I've seen that happen, and I disagree. My background is that the World Health Organization asked me back in, I don't remember the exact year, but this is more than 25 years ago. They asked me to write the draft issue, the draft document for the environmental health criteria for fluoride. And I did so. I delivered it. And then they called an expert group to do the final assessment and whatever necessary adjustments. And I was then considered part of the secretariat because I was the author of the draft document. And what happened was that most of the experts that had been selected had a dental background. Some of them came from the WHO Office of Oral Health. And so they criticized my draft. So when I said that fluoride was associated with adverse effects on this and that, they added, but only in huge doses and similar. And in the end, they asked me if I would kindly go to the library and find a reference that they thought was needed. And so they essentially asked me to leave the meeting. So I said, I will leave the meeting and I won't come back. So I asked WHO to take my name off the document. And then they published a document the way that the dental people, majority, would like to see it. And then they put another colleague's name on as the originator of the draft. And this was a colleague who didn't know his name was on the document and who had not been part of the process.
Do you remember the title of this document?
Yes, it's the environmental health criteria document for fluoride. And that clearly showed that there were very strong oral health, that is dental interests, and that they were not interested in looking at potentials for adverse effects, which is of course critical in certain areas of the planet. There are parts of East Africa that have very high levels in the drinking water, parts of China, and several other countries. And therefore, I think it's a disgrace for a very limited prevention interest to impose their wishes onto situations elsewhere where fluoride is clearly an environmental health problem. And so anyway, I've maintained this critique since it happened. And to me, that was a very strong indication that the people who have taken responsibility for adding fluoride to drinking water, they are not always honest. And perhaps they are unwilling to admit that they made an error in the past. And I think that that's a very important property or talent, if you want. It's important that we allow our observations, we allow nature to vote, and that we rely on our documentation rather than our opinions from the past that may be outdated. And that's what I think the fluoridation decision is. It's outdated because now we have fluoridated toothpaste and we have lacquers. So it's there's no need for the fluoride in the drinking water. And as we now know, it's actually harmful.
Yes, you're so right. Because if we don't recognize this, the toxicity, we can't look at the toxicity in the areas that are natural, let alone the areas that are being fluoridated. And in New Zealand, PSGR observed that in the inquiry for the Director General, there was absolutely no endocrinologist, no one who had experience in neurodevelopmental toxicology, no one experienced at looking at low dose exposures. And the Australian and New Zealand, a lot of the risk assessment has gone on together. And from what I can see in the 2016, I need to understand the 2016 authors aren't really, their expertise is not declared. And then from 2017 onwards, there's a notional, pediatric expert that has been interested in neuropsychology, but there's no scientists that I would dare say have your expertise in this field. And we are seeing that they are oral and facial clinical experts, dental clinical experts. We're seeing exactly the same captured scope. And the problem is science is as vulnerable to capture as anything else, because it's ultimately a human endeavor. And so it's about us sort of moving forward and hoping to draw attention to these issues. So I very much thank you for your time, Professor Philippe Grandjean. It's been such a pleasure talking with you.
I wish you luck.
Thank you very much.